Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 78. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode.
My name's Jeff Granger, and I'm a military volunteer at Northampton Museum. The object is a medal. It's a military cross that was awarded during the First World War, specifically to a Lieutenant Arthur Parker, who was well known to anybody who knew the 2nd Battalion of the Northamptonshire Regiment. To my mind, it symbolises the sacrifices made on a particular day during the First World War.
Tell me about that day.
The day was the 9th of May, 1915, at a place in France called Aubers, or Aubers as the British would say, Aubers Ridge. And it involved both the 1st and the 2nd Battalion of the Northamptonshire Regiment. It was a day which I think can be legitimately called the blackest day in the history of Northamptonshire. Something like 400 to 500 men of Northamptonshire Regiment died in this action at Aubers Ridge.
How many men started that day?
Well, you would have had two battalions, and two battalions, a battalion at the time was roughly 1,000 men. So the toll on that particular day was unimaginable.
Why were so many lost?
Very good question. It was an ill-conceived battle. It was part of the Second Battle of Artois, which the French General Joffre was adamant the British should take part in. The object of the exercise, well, the battle, was to remove German defenders from the high ground which they'd seized in the early part of 1914. That would have removed quite a lot of German ability to transport troops behind the line, because there were some very important railway junctions and railway lines. And by reaching those objectives, that would have curtailed a lot of German activity. The Germans were really interested in bringing the Soviet Union out of the war. And so their main attention, battle objectives, was to take the Russians out. And so they maintained as fewer troops on the Western Front, as it was then, as possible. Well, Joffre got wind of this, and he, with his British allies, decided that the time was right to try and take out a lot of the German forces on the Western Front. Strategically, if it had been successful, it would have helped enormously. Aubers Ridge is only about 60 feet high, but it's high enough for the Germans who are occupying it to dominate or have a dominant view of the British troops who are below them, not more than half a mile away, and occupying rain-sodden trenches. Now, these trenches weren't the trenches that we imagine. The ground was so wet that they couldn't actually dig trenches, so they built sandbag parapets, and the Germans could identify and watch what was going on quite easily. They also had knowledge that there was going to be an attack, and so very quickly they dug reinforced bunkers. Now, the British artillery had a problem. It had used its guns quite a lot in 1914, and a lot of them had worn-out barrels. Not only that, but a lot of the ammunition that was used was faulty. When the Northants were about to set off at H-hour, which was 5:50 in the morning, it followed after a bombardment by the British artillery that began at 5 o'clock, but it hadn't been effective. And not only were the Germans able to then pop out of their deep dugouts, but they had also very cleverly set up machine gun posts in no man's land, which were then, from the side or from the flanks, able to aim at the forward-moving Northamptons and machine gun them from the side.
So the Northamptonshires were sitting ducks?
They were certainly sitting ducks, and as soon as H-hour was sounded and the whistles were blown, the men clambered over the tops and were met by a hail of machine gun and artillery fire aimed at those sandbags.
So So the recipient of this medal, tell me about him.
Well, Lieutenant Parker was the commander of a company called D Company, and they managed to get forward over 400 to 500 yards and get into the German trenches, and they were the only unit of that whole battalion that actually made it. They were forced to remain there all day under constant attack by the German defenders. Nobody could reach them because no other company of the Northants were able to reach them, and so these men stayed there all day fighting off counterattacks by the German troops, and in the end were reduced to 26 men. And it was only after night fell that they were able to crawl back to their own lines. Lieutenant Parker was the only British officer who was able to lead his men at least into the German lines, so he was successful, and for his courage he was awarded the Military Cross.
When it comes to the ranking of medals, how far up does the Military Cross go?
It's about third down from the Distinguished Service Order, and above that you have the Victoria Cross.
So these crosses are a rarity?
Indeed.
Jeff, you said that this medal was concerned with one day.
Yeah.
What happened to Parker for the rest of his First World War?
He continued. He was not wounded on that particular day, as it happens, miraculously. But then he was wounded twice, I think during the Battle of the Somme. He was also mentioned in dispatches again. He survived, and eventually he became a lieutenant colonel of the regiment and served in his final days as the commander of the depot here in Northampton.
So presumably as an individual he's held in particularly high regard here
Indeed.
in Northampton.
Indeed.
And Northamptonshire.
Indeed, and he was loved by his men because he was a real soldier's officer.
What do you think this item, as a single item, says about Northamptonshire? And I suppose within that question, what I'm also getting at is the relationship between Parker and his men and what they were defending when you think back to Northamptonshire itself.
Well, of course, the cliches are that they fought for king and country to defend our land against a potential invader, because the Germans, let's face it, they had an ultimate game plan. They wanted to be the conquerors of Europe and the major force. And for the British, who relied on trade, to have the possibility of access to Europe, to Middle Europe in particular, denied by a conquering German force was unacceptable. So in a sense, indirectly, the Northants on the day, as part of the bigger picture, were defending the British economy.
And does this day not have a connection into World War II?
Very much so, because on the very day that Northampton's 2nd Battalion were crossing that no man's land, they were actually faced by a German regiment called the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment. Amongst its soldiers, there were regimental runners who had to take messages between regimental headquarters and the front line. And amongst these runners was one Private Adolf Hitler.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Indeed, because if the Northants had been able to achieve their objectives and had swept through the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment, Hitler would have either been killed or taken prisoner. And then, as you say, history would have changed.
You mentioned that he'd started out from what was a fairly well-fortified bunker.
Yeah, indeed. And in 1940, after France had capitulated, Adolf Hitler insisted on doing a sentimental journey around the First World War battlefields. And I have a photo of him actually on that bunker, which I then visited myself.
Concrete bunkers versus sandbags. I think you've said it all there. Jeff, what is your personal reaction to this cross? It is you who suggested that it should be in the exhibition. What do you feel about it as a person?
When I handle it, it evokes in me the sense of the sacrifices that were made by our community, mostly Northamptonshire people, not all, because a lot were drafted in from outside to make up numbers after the previous battles. But it makes me reflect on our local society, our communities, and you know jolly well that every village has a memorial to men who were lost. And if they're Northamptonshire men, there's a fair chance that they were lost in the Battle of Ober's Ridge.
Jeff, it's great to have people like you bringing to modern day minds the pictures, the images, the sense of what people did for the greater good for us in the modern world. And this particular exhibit and the very, very personal relationship that it has to perhaps the freedoms that we now take for granted. Thank you for telling me about Lieutenant Parker and that very, very dark day in Northamptonshire's history.
It's been my privilege. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.